from your LaSalle works into the later ones that you made in LA or America, I've already seen this kind of clear transition in both techniques and story, the materials that you try to work on, and is more accepting of your new environment instead of focusing on more kind of a Singaporean materials. But I see also there's a sort of a consistency in here. Your interest in diaspora and female figures, melodramas, and this kind of nostalgic atmosphere seem to stay in some way in latter works as well. So I'm just wondering how your journey in America has reshaped your film and your identity. And when dealing with a memoryscape of quote unquote others or other cultures, how do you feel about this sort of challenges and possibilities in a new environment and working with new actors and actresses and new cultures?
Just in context to comparisons to someone who's American. Because in Singapore, we grew up watching things, not just made in Singapore, but we grew up watching Hong Kong dramas, Chong Yao dramas, or American sitcoms, UK dramas. So very international. Whatever you want to watch, you can. It's sort of like, just somehow that was what we grew up with. For example, I watched Friends as a teenager, this American sitcom, right? Friends. And then there are all these other shows that were set in New York. And I would remember thinking as a kid, I want to go to New York because I just see so much of New York in literature, in films, or in television. There is this idea of what New York is, this beacon of freedom, this amazing city, and it's everything you dreamed of. But with Friends, I'm always like, oh yeah, this is the group of friends who live in New York in this apartment, this lifestyle you would want to have. And then I remember, and I knew as I get older, like Friends wasn't shot in New York. It was shot in a soundstage in LA. So when I worked in LA and I had to go to Warner Brothers, the studio, to pick up props, and then I got to see the soundstage that Friends was shot in, I think there was a sense of suddenly realizing that there's so much construction of what the memory is of a certain place that you've never been before. Just as how it is in filmmaking, a lot of times it's just constructing this idea of memory into sets. So for me, as a Singaporean, I think when I'm in the US, the idea of code switching, at least for me, it becomes very automatic. Whether it's the way I speak or whether it's the way I present myself, just
do you change your Singlish accent?
I code switch. I think my accent becomes very, right now I feel like it's quite neutral, not very Singaporean. I haven't spoken Singlish yet, but when I'm surrounded by Americans or if I talk to someone who's American, my mind automatically just kind of like, because I want to get this across quickly. Not that my accent will switch, but it's just kind of like I'll speak a lot faster, certain things will change. I just want to make sure you understand what I'm saying because I don't want to have to repeat myself. But then on another layer, I think because this is what I understand about, and I've shared this with my friends in the US, even now I'm seeing it from a different perspective. I think sometimes, and this is not to reduce it to that, but it's assumed that I'm Asian American, which is a completely different identity altogether. And I'm like, I didn't grow up in the US. But I understand maybe through TV or through whatever, I understand a version of what it is, but I don't have that experience. I don't have the reality of what it means to be Asian American growing up in the US.
Crazy Rich Asians. Do you think that's more ABC version of Singapore?
Not even ABC. I think it's a very white American version.
It's white American version.
White American thinks Crazy Rich Asian is Singapore, and I'm like, no, it's not. I had a whole discussion of Crazy Rich Asian with my class in Singapore where we dissect an idea of representation of Crazy Rich Asian with another Singaporean film called A Yellow Bird. Two very contrasting films. And who are these films made for is another question we would ask. It's not made for Singaporeans. What does that mean? Did they make it specifically for a kind of audience? And I think it's made for the masses. And by masses, do you mean Caucasian Americans? Is it made for Asian Americans who want to see themselves on screen? I think those are very valid questions. So there's no one straight answer, but I do realize I boil it down to my responsibility as a filmmaker. I can be anywhere in the world. I can be in the US, I can be in Singapore, where I'm from, I can be in Hainan, I can be in Seoul in Korea making Ajuma. My responsibility is that if I'm telling a story that is set in that space, it's my job to make sure that it is as authentic as it can be for someone who's from there. But I'm also very keenly aware that the author and the act of looking is still from me, the Singaporean.
Yeah.
I'm always going to be an outsider if I'm telling a story set in America or in Korea. You can't run away from that. But your job
Right.
as a storyteller is to create that space of that being that is still very much authentic to the characters that you have created who are from there. So like when I made And the Wind Falls, became somewhat sort of specific about where this is going to be. So it became this, oh, it's so specific that it's in this part of outside of Los Angeles and this very working class town. Its details for me is just trying to create specificity of the world that I'm creating. So I wanted to create that realness, I guess, that I think it's important to do that. I don't see it so much as a challenge, but I think it's creating a world. And that's my job, is to create that world that when you watch it or when you experience it, you understand that it could be real. It is almost a memoryscape to someone who possibly has lived through it or have
Right.
lived a version of it.
On the one hand, I feel like you do feel this responsibility to the other people that living in the space that you shot your films in or you make your works in. So there's this kind of connection between the audience and art that you feel that has to be real or at least to look real or act real in some way. On the other hand, I feel like a lot of big challenges for diaspora artists or artists that are not creating works in their mother tongue culture. Sometimes they feel disconnection. I don't know if you have felt it when you're making your works in a different space because you didn't grow up in there. And another thing is that because you're making a film as real as possible to the people living there, there may be someone actually from the community or from the space that you make your works in that may say, oh, this is sort of amateurish. It's not really real. It's your version of being real. So that's actually some kind of risks in making films or making art just in general as a diasporic individual. I do see that as a challenge, but at the same time, I see that as a possibility to take as well.
Like filming in Seoul, for example, and I wrote the script in English and it has to be translated into Chinese for my actor, only speak Mandarin, and also in Korean because majority of my cast and crew are in Korean.
Right.
Also very keenly aware that when it goes through those rounds of translation into languages, that changes also. So it went through a few rounds because someone who made the first round of translation really directly translated it. The dialogue are not gonna, it's gonna sound weird. So then it has to go through another round of translation by someone else to kind of like, okay, I understand now the director's or the writer's intention, and I can change certain words to fit the narrative that I'm trying to create. Because filmmaking as an art form is very collaborative, it's not just my version, this is what I want to do. I have to take in a lot of inputs from people who work with me to create something. So sure, I have a vision of certain things or a message I want to tell, but I can only do that with the people that work with me, that I collaborate with. So it's the same, I guess, for Ajuma, where there was so many layers of construction and changing the semantics of things that I don't speak Korean. So then it is really putting the trust to someone to kind of go like, they're saying it right. The nuance is there, the performance is there. And I have to really entrust that to someone who is speaking the language that I don't speak. At least if it's in Mandarin, I can sort of like, okay, there is still a bit of understanding of what it is. But if it's a language that I don't speak, it makes it even more challenging, I think. In the American context, I think sometimes it's just because it's so widely stretched out, or at least I'm exposed to American culture in a much wider, broader sense. I think it's easier for me to kind of then go like, oh, okay, that I can have an opinion about this as an outsider because it's someone who speaks the language. The specificity I can kind of create on my own. But in the language I don't speak, it is trusting it on someone who is local.
And we have the last question. The last question will be more technical. So I've noticed a material object, especially the old object, seem to recur in your works as the key items to connect certain figures or broader histories or certain plots. So I think that you seem to really attach a lot of importance to these little objects and a lot of emotional significance that you have conferred. So how do you see the usage of objects or materials in your films as a key to tell the story and aesthetics?
I think sometimes nostalgia, especially maybe coming from Singapore, or maybe it doesn't have to be from Singapore, but it's just the reality of the world that we live in that's changing so rapidly. I think there's a certain stubbornness to nostalgia, to old objects, Sometimes one will argue nostalgia is useless. Don't hold on to it because it goes away so fast. But I think in context of Singapore, we're so used to seeing things and places and people disappear in front of us so quickly. Buildings can be built and they're torn down almost instantaneously. Or buildings that you grew up seeing are gone, or neighborhoods are just changed because in the name of redevelopment. So I think we hold on to things so tightly because you're afraid that you'll forget them or you will lose them. I think sometimes there's a conscious or maybe even subconscious effort to kind of present that nostalgia or that feeling or that senses through these objects because they're tangible. And then when it comes to creating a memoryscape, these objects sort of reminds you of certain things or a certain moment or a certain emotion of how it is to be present because of that fear that it would disappear as quickly as you even remember it. And that's what I kind of learned about, at least from my being as a filmmaker in Singapore or growing up here, is that there was a period of time, and sometimes I still is, really wanting to hold on to something before it goes away because it is a heartbreak. I think when things disappear, it becomes a heartbreak. So I kind of wanted to share, and I've not talked about this yet, but this short little project I'm working on currently, it's called Goodbye Lion City. I don't know if you remember this cinema, the Cafe, which has been around for a while. It's in a building run by Cafe. So they're closing on July 10th, next month, where they're going to redevelop the inside. But then I found out that the cinema is no longer going to be there. And this is a cinema that's been around for a while. I remember my very first time going to the cinema was that particular cinema, watching Beauty and the Beast, when I was 5. So when I found out that it was disappearing, there was a certain sense of numbness because that's what happens to buildings. But there was a part of me that was filled with this immense sadness towards this idea of cinema. I think also my experience releasing my first feature film, Ajuma, in the cinemas post-COVID, and also in a world where we consume things very differently. We watch things on our phone. There's just a paradox of choice when it comes to watching things. So I wanted to sort of work on that a little bit. I wanted to shoot a film in this particular cinema on the very last day before they close. And it is also a homage to Tsai Ming-liang film called Goodbye Dragon Inn. Goodbye Dragon Inn is a film he made in 2003. Tsai Ming-liang came across the cinema that was closing down, so he shot a film there also. So it's about the cinema that's playing on the very last day of their business. They're playing this wuxia pian. And the actor who was in this wuxia pian came to watch the film. And there's intersecting stories between this guy who is in the film as an older self watching himself on screen, a Japanese tourist who is there to seek some sort of cheap thrill, and then a receptionist who, in the whole film, this is her last day of her job, and she's just eating a shou tao. And then there is the projectionist also, who is played by Li Kangsheng, who is a frequent Tsai Ming-liang collaborator. So it was one of the films that I remember watching and just felt really, really sad watching it because the emotions I felt about this cinema closing. Maybe this is my professional career as an artist, but also I'm a filmmaker. So the cinema is this sacred space that as an audience, it is also immensely sacred because it's where you watch films. You are sharing energy and sharing this communal space with the audience. And now it's gone, because of the way the world is moving. So I wanted to sort of pay homage to that film, but also pay homage to cinema and coming to terms with the fact that, is this the death of cinema? Is this the end? Is this it? And I think cinema has gone through several deaths. There was a period of time where musicals were just so rampant and people just didn't want to watch it anymore. Today, we have an influx of people don't want to see superhero movies anymore. I hope that they will come, So, and also just the way we watch things have changed, I think. So I think it is a way of seeing cinema as a filmmaker today, eulogizing its death, I think. So I'm working on that now. We are working towards shooting this short little project on the very last day of the closure next month. And I think it's a way to kind of close this or reflect on this chapter that I've had in the last 6 years making Ajuma and releasing it and seeing it from that perspective.